Good morning, everybody. This is your host, Chedva Rose, for the Jewish Adulting Podcast. I have with me, in what I consider the crack of dawn, Dr. Asher Siegelman from Israel. And he is a psychologist with a specialty in clinical okay, I don't know. See, I shouldn't have done it. Suicidality. No, I don't know. You say it.
It's perfect. Clinical suicidality. I think it's great.
Okay, great. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about where you've been, how you've got here, and how did you get to this place where this was what you were focusing on?
It's a good question. Where I really started and was with this focus on pursuing psychology, yes, but specifically looking to work with trauma victims, post-traumatic stress disorder specifically. It happens to be that along this journey, and I was at the time I was at Emory University in Atlanta, and I met a really well-respected professor there who was working on trauma work, but she had a side focus which was on suicide prevention, which I'd actually never dealt with. But what became very clear was that people who were the most severe cases of trauma, this was a real serious issue. This would be something that would come up more frequently, at least in thoughts, right, as we call it, suicidal ideation. And so she would focus on that. She ultimately became the person who made the connection between me and my doctoral mentor, who was Dr. David Jobs, who's at the Catholic University of America, who is really one of the world experts on the intervention, right, meaning treatment of suicide risk. So actually preventing people from dying, to be very clear about it. And spending the 6.5 years I spent with him, it is really what developed that focus. And while, yes, it sounds like a really disturbing topic, intense topic, the experience for me as a clinical suicidologist is one in which I literally have the feeling, not just the feeling, the experience of saving people's lives. So it is an intense experience, but it's also extremely, what's the word? I guess,
Sounds like it's meaningful and impactful.
That's
yeah. So it's like it's your way of it reminds me of that story, where there's a little boy who's walking along, who's on the shore throwing starfish into the sea that have washed up ashore, and an old man says, "There's thousands of starfish. What are you doing?" And it's not going to matter. And the little boy throws the starfish back in the water, and he says, "It matters to this one, and then it matters to this one." It's like, one starfish at a time.
Yeah. Well, in I think where I would take it as well is that we know as human beings and as Jewish people, that the impact of one person's life is so powerful, right, on multiple people surrounding them, right? And we have that view as well as Jewish people, that our life, even if you were to remove everybody else, or you to make a claim that like, what if I'm isolated and there is no one else? It's like you were put here for a purpose, right? That's how I choose to view the work that I have with people, right?
So let's actually let's go into the topic from like the perspective of anecdotally where I am, meaning I'm not a professional. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was once October 7th happened, I have a source in Israel who I would speak to on a weekly basis, and they would keep me updated on all the news. And they would talk to me about the amount of, they would talk to me about the suicide that was occurring as a result of the war. And I wondered to myself, is this actually true? Are there people who are because of the post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of October 7th, is there really an increase in numbers? And then there was an unfortunate amount of suspicious deaths because, they don't always come out, especially in the frum community, that were, what happened here. And it's not like it's anyone's business, but it makes you concerned because you start to wonder, first of all, there's a component, the Jewish religious component, which is what does Tanakh or the Torah or Rabbanim say about suicidality? And let's just stop there because I do have a habit of asking multiple questions at once, and I'm going to try not to do that. So let's stop there. What do we, it's different for us versus other cultures, other religions. Everybody has their own way of looking at it, but what do we know about suicidality in Tanakh and in Judaism?
So, Chedwa, it's interesting that you're bringing this up because I also had the perspective that there's a unique, fear within the Jewish community, specifically around suicide, because there is this, in general, this view that, well, suicide is usher. Like, let's just be honest about it. Like, you're not allowed to kill yourself, okay? Now, that's very nice to say, right? But if somebody is suicidal, it's like, that doesn't help, okay? You can't tell somebody who's suicidal, it's usher. It's like,
right.
It doesn't help.
They're beyond caring about the letter of the law.
Yeah, and more importantly, it's not even that they don't care. It's that they're in such darkness, right? They're in so much pain that there is no real experience of any alternative. Okay, so it's like you picture being in such a darkness, okay, and that begins to creep in as a possible solution. Okay, because that ultimately is the foundation of this problem, tremendous suffering. And I work on trying to educate people about how there needs to be a shift in our focus on suicide, where it's not an issue of somebody wants to die. It's an issue of someone does not want to suffer anymore. Okay, and they're trying to find a solution to that, and this is what they have come to. Right, this seems like the best option for them. And then ultimately, obviously, my work is about helping them to experience a life in which there are actually other solutions. All right, but it really does begin with understanding first and foremost, like, wait, what is this darkness? Wait, what's the suffering that you're experiencing right now? Okay, so when the person is in that darkness, though, like, technically, you're right. It could say, oh, they don't care about the letter of the law, but it's much worse than that. Okay, it's like you can't see. Okay, so we can't even talk about laws and mitzvahs, and this is why I've had cases where, the Rabbanim have told me, this person, I had a recent case, a girl, I was told that she cannot fast on Yom Kippur. Right, that's a big deal. Okay, but why? Because she was in such severe risk for suicide. Right, that fasting was going to be something that would put her at greater risk. Okay, so it changes reality. The Rav actually said her mitzvah is to not fast. Her mitzvah is to actually eat on Yom Kippur. Okay, so it creates a whole different reality because the whole focus here is on pikuach nefesh, saving somebody's life. Now, when I spoke with again a recent conversation, it was actually a Hasidic Rav in the community where I live in Beit Shemesh. I asked him, like, what do you think's going on with people who are afraid to talk about this issue? They shy away from it. Do you think it's a halachic issue? Right? They're concerned about halacha. Like, what if it gets out that the family member died by suicide? There's going to be a whole discussion about the halachic ramifications. And he himself looked at me as a Hasidic person, okay? And he said, no, I don't think it has anything to do with halacha. I think it has to do with something much more basic, just embarrassment, the feeling of shame in the family that it gets out and people hear, they're like, wow, this person's kid died by suicide? which was very eye-opening to me because I really thought like, oh yeah, it's a halachic issue. People are very concerned about halacha. Now, again, this is anecdotal. I haven't conducted research to poll people and see, if this is really the issue. But it does look like that, like a stigma, right? Shame, embarrassment, humiliation. Like people will do everything they can, be very, very quiet to avoid having to be confronted by that kind of emotion. Is terrible, right?
Right. Well, it happens to be that a lot of times people think that it's this big secret, and often it is. But would you say that often there are factors that can be identified beforehand that sort of indicate this kind of the risks associated with suicidality? Like it's known, if I go on a diet, it's not a secret that I need to lose a few pounds. I think it's this big secret. It's not a big secret. So do you find that with suicidality, that people are able to mask so well that there's no clues, there's no signs, there's no hints? What would be indicators of risk that you've seen and clinically?
Yeah. I think it's very, very hard to point to anything external in a reliable way, meaning that it works, consistently. Like if you see this kind of pattern or this kind of sequence of factors together, be concerned, right? It just doesn't play out that way. It doesn't work. And why is that? Because the what we call the base rate. Okay. So the actual level of risk of this being something that is in the mix of all the other problems the person has is actually quite rare. It's not as common as you think, right? So you may say that like, oh, but the person is suffering from depression and we know that. Well, yeah, but the problem is that about 95% of the people who suffer from depression are not thinking about suicide. So it's really an inappropriate approach to say like, well, they've got depression, so therefore they must have suicide risks. It's wrong.
Right.
It's wrong.
I think we're all looking for that clue, and probably in hindsight, when chas v'shalom someone does take their own life, people are probably wondering, what could I have done? Why didn't I notice? What was I doing wrong that they felt like they couldn't come to me? And so that's probably why people try to use some external indicator. Oh, they were sleeping all day and they were avoiding my calls and they were whatever we're trying to find that clue that we have. And you're saying it's not that simple. There's not necessarily going to be an indicator. If someone's very serious about it, it might just happen unexpectedly and you're not going to have that, big red flag that you're looking for.
That's correct. And that's the scary art of this issue. Okay. I always tell people that the people I'm most scared about are the ones who refuse to see me. They just say, nope, I don't want to see. And the truth is I'm taking on, trying to figure out how do I present this differently so I don't show up for people as it's just another psychologist. Right? I see lots of psychologists and none of them do anything for me. It's like, that's not what I am. I'm a clinical suicidologist. Okay. And the whole focus that I have is on suicide prevention. That's a rare niche area.
Yes.
It's not, it's here in Israel. I honestly cannot tell you who else to go to at this point for what I know to be suicide focused care. And that's how I describe it. I have a colleague who I know is very good, and she does a fantastic job of it with an evidence-based treatment that works also for suicide risk. And she doesn't speak Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
So here we are in a country where, listen, the native language is Hebrew. I speak Hebrew. But where that leaves me with the Hebrew-speaking population is that I have no one to refer them to. I really have no one to refer them to. No one that I would trust, and I won't refer them to somebody I won't trust. That's
Right.
just, it's irresponsible. So I'll take them on and work with them because I know what I'm doing.
Right.
But still, it doesn't deal with the issue of this person who won't see me. They want nothing to do with me, and because I know from experience they've had bad experiences. They worked with someone who didn't know how to address this issue, or to my sadness, really, tzari, as we say in Hebrew. They met with someone who was dismissive. They don't have a problem. They're fine. And they should just go home. They take this medication. Right. So ignoring the suffering is really what it is. So what this brings me to also, though, that I would like to highlight in terms of looking for something to focus on, it's really important for, if you take anything out of this, right? Like the one most important thing, as I see it, is that suicide risk is suffering. Okay. And the real answer to it is connection. Okay, so what do I mean? If you see someone struggling, who you know, right, it's your family member or your friend, you ask them about what's going on. Like you get interested in what they're struggling with, right? And you start to talk to them about, hey, what's the magnitude of this suffering for them? Because ultimately, you want to be able to take yourself to a place where you can actually ask your family member, hey, it looks like you're having a really, really hard time. You're really stressed out. You're really overwhelmed. You're in a lot of pain. Some people in that kind of situation, they'll actually think about ending it. Like they'll think about killing themselves. Is that something you've ever thought of? Or like being very direct. This is where it gets really tricky for people, though, because it's like, oh my God, how can you ask a question like that? But this is the issue. This is where people call it intense, right? Because it is. That's a serious conversation.
Right. Well, it's also, I think, a little bit different in the Jewish community than it would be in the secular community, because the stigma around it, the openness to having this kind of conversation, where so much the person who has a suicidality has a lot of shame and guilt, and as well as whatever they're suffering that they're going through, but there's something holding back those kind of intimate, open conversations because of this, all the stigma around suicidality. That's a little bit different. Not that there isn't stigma outside of the Jewish community, but I do think that it is a harder conversation. It's compounded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
You might be right, and I kind of wonder as well if it's really even limited to this. Like it seems like it's something in general that permeates our culture. Like the idea of truly connecting with other people, truly like getting interested in just your own family. Let's like forget about people outside of your family. Just being connected to your own family members on such a level that you're able to have this kind of conversation with them, right? So if we want to just honor the stigma parts and just be sensitive to that, and like, yeah, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of fear around this getting out, like no problem. So just focus on your family.
Right.
You get interested in your family members and your kids and your spouse, right? And what they're struggling with, and talk to them. Like, hey, is this? Tell me about this struggle.
Right. So let's go a little bit. Take a step back. You were mentioning about that you're one of the only that you're aware of, Hebrew speaking suicidologists that you know of. And it leads me to the question of how do people come to you? Do they go, like, are they institutionalized and then they come to you, or what is the person who's reaching out to you? Where are they coming from? Why are they reaching out to you? Basically, it's obviously there's this time during the suffering that they call out for help. But where are you coming from? Like, I know in America, there's institutions, specifically targeting suicidality. in Baltimore, we have Shepherd Pratt. I have no idea other because it's a local thing. How does it work in Israel in terms of dealing with this problem, and how do people get to you?
It's a great question. So, there's two things here. It sounds like one is what actually happens, and the other one is how do they get to me?
Oh,
How they get to me is something that I'm working on, and that's largely just networking with organizations and individuals who are connected to organizations to let them know, well, first of all, what it is exactly that I do, but more importantly, like what the problem is with what's being done. Okay,
right.
like what big deal? Like, wait, oh, somebody's suicidal. So, like here in Israel, largely they are referred to a psychiatrist who ultimately decides whether or not they need to be hospitalized. There's certainly conversation about the medication they need to be on and what diagnosis they have. All of these approaches, when it comes to suicide risk, are wrong. When we're looking at suicide risk, the focus has to be on suicide risk, not on what's their diagnosis, do they need to be hospitalized, and what medication do they need. That's not how it works. All of the data shows that what works is that you take what's called a suicide-focused approach. Okay, and that's what I do. So how do they get to me then? The reality is, this is why I'm meeting at a meeting today with an organization who works specifically with what they call the Siegelman, right? The Haredi community, right? It's called. I'm asking permission to use that name, but it's who else knows? Lev Shomer is what it's called, right? So we're in touch. And now they know that I exist, and they said very directly to me that it's so relieving for them to know that they have somebody who's a religious Jew who is properly trained, because they have a big problem with trying to find well-trained people who are actually religious. So there's a lot of fear also within the religious population. Like, wait, who am I going to see? How's this person going to work with me? Also in Israel, things are not like America, right? It's hard to tell, like, wait, how do we know this person is going to get the help that they need, right? Within the system of care, right? Especially when we're dealing with suicide, where we know that the protocol that's followed is not based on evidence-based care. Okay, which means that again, you're taking a suicide-focused approach. Right, you use assessments that are based on research in order to determine like the level of severity of risk, and then you're developing a intervention and treatment plan for the person, and you have someone to refer them to, right, to carry that out, right, and one of the referral places is not the hospital. Again, it's cyclical. It's like we think, oh, you go to a hospital and they certainly know how to do everything. It's not true. It's not true.
Right. A hospital. So the hospital really serves as like a safety net, not necessarily a treatment center, more of a like preventing it from happening, but not through interventions and this sort of suicide. I can't remember the language you used, but suicide focused therapy. So that's interesting. But and then speaking to this anecdote where it feels like as a result of the war, there's more suicidality in Israel. Is that based on the research that I did, to coming to this conversation? It seemed like that was actually a misconception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think this is an important point. Also, one of the things that got this started was a rumor. To be quite blunt about it, there was a person who participated in a Knesset hearing. I don't even know what the full story was because it wasn't reported in its entirety. All that was reported in a news write-up was that this person got up and started talking about how there are 50 people he knows from the Nova concert survivors who killed themselves. And in that same meeting, somebody else got up and said, that's not true. Where's your data? Like, where'd you get this information from? Like, they rebutted it immediately. That part wasn't reported in the article.
Right.
Something that had it was not verified. There was no evidence to support this. It was weird to me that the person came up with 50. It's like, why? If you're going to
random, yeah.
Okay, why would you say 50? Like, what? I don't understand. I wanted to talk to the person, actually. I wanted to find out who it was. Like, what's going on? What had you mention this? What had you say it like this? But again, we did not get the full story. I got lots of calls from people who were understandably really distressed. Like, oh my God, this is terrible. How could this happen? And I reached out to my colleagues here in Israel who deal with these issues, and they know what's happening. And they said also, yeah, this is a terrible rumor that just got out, and we're trying now to respond. But they work in the government, so it's like government never responds fast as private media.
Right. I mean, on one hand, you could say, this is terrible. On the other hand, it does shine a light on PTSD as a result of October 7th, regardless, however you want to say, that it's not true. But it doesn't take away from the fact that there are people suffering PTSD as a result of October 7th and the war that's currently in play.
That's right. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I think, look, it's the silver lining of what happened. I agree with you that, like, ultimately what it did do was, get people very concerned about the severity of this, the potential severity, right? It has led to further conversations about concerns and how, while we haven't seen any kind of like spike, let's say, right, in suicides, there's certainly a lot more suffering, right? And if we're talking about suicide risk as a state of suffering, okay, so that's very relevant, right? That makes sense. You're inherently people are ending up in situations that increase risk, okay?
Right.
And so it does necessitate the conversation of like, wait a minute, what are we going to do? Like, if you leave the stress and the pain, that darkness where it is, and there's no focus on addressing that can lead to a state then of hopelessness, okay? And together that can be a very deadly mixture. And so there does have to be a conversation, and it is starting. There is some writing that's being done that I've seen come out about how this very issue is a concern. And I've got a conference on December 1st in Tel Aviv with the National Suicide Prevention Team here in Israel, right? Where they asked me to come, and we're going to talk about what's happening, and I'm going to be more there to hear what they're discussing and how they're planning on addressing than to be here. But
right. So it seems that there is certain populations that are at higher risks than others, specifically in Israel. But we could talk about, based on the research I did, which obviously was basically based on Google and Times of Israel and health.gov. And, I tried my best to do what I could do just to have some conversation that seemed somewhat intelligent.
Yep.
Was that, immigrants are particularly high. The young and the elderly, those are particularly high. But that in general, Israel has one of the lower suicidality numbers across the world.
That's right. It's a big deal. That's a very big deal.
It's a big deal, and furthermore, it seems that during times of war, suicide goes down.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Can you speak to that phenomenon?
Yeah. So, there's a couple of things. I'll speak to that first, but I want to come back to the idea of suicide rate, because it can be really, really misleading. But first of all, regarding, I guess just Well, let's start with the suicide rate issue, because I think it's really critical what you're highlighting. What we tend to do when it comes to suicide risk is really just think about death rates. Okay, like how many people die. So in Israel, you're right, like the rate of death is really remarkably small, right? It's a rare phenomenon. It's a rare phenomenon in the United States also, by the way. Okay, in terms of actual deaths that occur, right? The way that they have to talk about it is how many out of 100,000 people. Okay, like that's
right. With America's suicide rates is 16.1, whatever that means.
Right, out of 100,000.
Right. And in Israel, it's 5.3.
Right. Now, what becomes misleading about this is that we tend to say, oh, well, it's not so common, so we don't really have to worry about it. But when we think about it in terms of the theory of suicide and how it works, what we actually have to do is look at, like, back up, take a look at how many people are attempting to kill themselves. Right, like, yeah, we have X number who are dying. Be concrete about it. In America, and right, you're in America, so it's about 50,000 people a year who die by suicide. Okay, but when we look at the data on how many people attempt suicide, it's about 1.2 million people. Okay, who actually, they do something that's so serious that it requires medical intervention. Okay, they need to go to the hospital and they need to be healed, okay, because that's how serious it was, what they did. Okay, and then if we back up even further, okay, in America they do this. This is why I'm mentioning America, because they actually do this. They poll people, right, on a national level with nationally representative samples to see how many people are just thinking about this issue, right? They're just suffering, right, and thinking about how they would rather die, right, and maybe they even have a plan of how they would actually kill themselves. The numbers go up to, I think it was about 17 million people.
Wow.
Okay. So it's very misleading when we just say, like, yeah, it's about 50,000 people. That's a lot of people still, but
yeah,
we get the difference. Okay. Again, it is having to shift the perspective from what I call a focus on death to a focus on suffering. Okay. Because when you look at it from the angle of it, how many people are suffering, it's millions of people. Okay.
right.
In Israel, unfortunately, they don't collect data. They acknowledge this, that they need to be collecting data on how many people are just suffering with these thoughts. There was data collected back in 2001 by the World Health Organization, and they found that the rates of just suicidal ideation, just thinking about suicide, was about 5.5% of the population. Okay, so if we assume that nothing changed since 2001, and we consider population growth, that's about 500,000 people. Okay, so 500 people approximately die, right, every year by suicide in Israel, but about 500,000 are walking around thinking that's a really good option. Like that they've had enough. Like this is how much they're suffering. Right, so very big difference. Okay.
Yeah, I mean those are stark numbers. Those are astonishing numbers. Getting that's anxiety producing numbers, to be honest with you. So then speaking to the population that this most affects, right? Who are these people? And then as a community, you said connection. Think about your family member. Try to have a meaningful conversation about the suffering that they're having. So let's speak to who are these people, and then sort of what our reaction should be to that information.
Yeah, so the high risk populations, I think, it's a really helpful focus to have for us as maybe clinical suicidologists, researchers even, because what it helps us to notice is where could we strategically put our attention in order to, obviously the goal ultimately is to reduce suicide, right, or to eliminate it altogether. Like that, there's an initiative in the United States called the Zero Suicide initiative, right, where the ideal, right, we aspire to reduce suicide risks to a point where there are no suicides, right? I think that's beautiful, right? And I think it's an aspiration. Why not? In doing that, one of the efforts is to figure out, like, wait, where are the high risk populations? We talked about, like, you put somebody in a hospital, and that would make them at least, be in a safer environment. Well, the reality is that people, when they're in hospitals, medical hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, it's more stressful. Okay, and suicide risk actually goes up. Okay, in settings like that. So that I highlight that because it's important to understand that this assumption that we have put somebody in the hospital, it's not a comforting environment. It's not something that is common. Okay.
It seems that there's more of a desperation to see, like, if they could sort of get around the system, because they get more desperate. The suffering gets harder because now someone's saying this plan that you're hopeful will get rid of the pain. We're going to prevent that by stopping, limiting access to things that might harm you. I could see that being sort of an obstacle that people try to get around. And I could see that suicide risk being higher. I mean, it's distressing, but
yeah, and the truth is, people have been polled, right? And polled people who have been hospitalized for suicide risk, right? And asked them, like, what was it like? And the responses are really kind of hair raising. It's like, oh, it was not therapeutic. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
If their responses were like, it was punitive, it was restrictive, it was, shaming, humiliating, right? Like, not words that we want to be seeing when we're thinking about treatment facilities. Okay.
Right.
You're right. But here's the thing, that to get to your real question about, okay, so that's a higher risk population. That's helpful in the sense that we know, let's focus there. Let's focus on this population and help the organizations implement a system of care that can actually take care of these people, right? That can actually offer them the kind of care, the suicide-focused care that they really need. Okay. Look, this is something I'm working on here in Israel as well, right? This is where I live. This is where I'm focusing, right? But ultimately, the goal of the vision that I have is to help organizations implement systems of care that actually work. They're just based on research, right? I say just based on research, like, it's available. Like, you can read the research, and I don't want to make it sound so simple, because it's like, thank you, Dr. Siegelman. Like, you've got a PhD and you've read about this for many, many years. So you're familiar with the writing, and the people even who wrote these papers and did the research. But that's the point too. It's like, it's here. It's like, it's actually very clear. Like, the people who are writing are writing really well, and they're giving really good advice and good examples, and it's based on research, which means that it actually works.
Right. And that's for the clinician, which goes back to the same question of what can we as a community do, besides having, or is the answer continuing conversation? Is that the bottom line?
I think there is definitely the necessity for open conversations. Now, how to do that? Listen, first of all, I do believe it starts in the home. Okay, we have a model, right? We're in our own home. It's private. We don't have to reveal all of the things to the community. That's great. Like, let's utilize that. Like parents have found to be very receptive to the direction and guidance that I provide to them about how to take care of their kid who is suicidal. Okay. Which is wonderful. It's like there are real strategies that you can implement in order to actually take care of your loved one, right? The person who's living with you, right? You're the best positioned for doing that, right? As the caretaker, or as the parent, the spouse, right? Way better than I am, and you're going to be much higher up on the list of priorities of people to talk to, than I am. Yeah.
Right.
But another route that I'm also beginning to, or I've already begun, but I'm just increasing my conversations with, are the Rabbani Kehilos, right? The Rabbanim. Again, this is a group of people who is highly sought after by people who, well, just for questions, but also for advice. And when people are struggling, like, what do I do? Somebody was just telling me that it was interesting. I guess somebody did a study on why it is people reach out to Rabbanim, and he explained to me that the reason was it wasn't to necessarily get advice as much as get like approval for going to see someone, right? So in other words, me being connected to the Rabbanim is critical, right? Because it's like I want them to be aware of what this problem is, first of all. Right? How do we understand it? Okay. What could they do, right, in order to help someone who is suicidal? And what's the point at which they need to actually turn to me? They need to call me out and send the person to me, right? So all those are really important, because I know, these people are going to come to their Rabbanim, and I want the Rabbanim to feel safe with me also. Like, Dr. Siegelman is a legitimate person. Right, not just some doctor. I'm not sure that it works the same way in the United States, but I know here there's a lot of sensitivity around, like, wait, where is my kid going to go? Right, who is this person my kid's going to meet? Right, like, who said that they're okay? It's like it doesn't matter that I'm a doctor. It matters that their Rav said, yes, you need to go see Dr. Siegelman.
Right. So that was actually part of the conversation of how have Rabbanim, I feel like there's been possibly a shift. You could correct me, that the way that Rabbanim used to look at suicidality versus the way that they look at it now.
So that's a good question, Tedva, because last night, actually, I was part of a conversation with a group of mechanechim, right? So educators. I think most of the people there too were Rabbanim as well. They were sharing literature from various Hasidic Rabbanim who had written over 100 years ago about the issue of suicide. Specifically, the issue of suicide. In general, the issue of suffering and education problems and how teachers need to conduct themselves, in a warmer, more understanding way. But it sounded like what I'm faced with here, which look, again, I'm part of like a small group of people. I call it small because I've only met a few of them, who are very receptive and very warm, very interested in what I'm doing and how I can help them, and how they can help me, right, in terms of ultimately taking care of the Jewish people. But it didn't sound from, at least from, again, these are tremendous scholars. I think that Piazetzner Rebbe was the one specifically that I'm recalling, okay, who was writing about this issue. Okay, so that's an exceptional human being. He's not the representative necessarily of the community culture, right? Like, how are people viewing this? But again, you asked your question about Rabbana. I'm not sure if he's even representative of Rabbana. I don't know enough about all Rabbanim to be able to comment on that. But the Rabbanim I have met are extremely sensitive to this issue, and if anything has changed, actually, it's the level of concern. Why? Because the suffering and the deaths that have gone on have increased over the years. Right? I had one Rav who shared with me that he's been a community Rav for 30 plus years, and he said he's seen more suicides in the last 2 years than he's seen in his entire career as a community Rav. And he qualified that and said, like, don't get the impression that, like, I haven't been involved or something. Like, I'm always connected to the community and I know what's happening, and it's really disturbing. Like, the last, and this was a couple of years ago already when he said this to me.
Was this post COVID, during COVID?
But post-COVID or during the COVID period where he was seeing this issue coming up. So again, I think that's a good question actually, because it's getting at another issue that is an international stress issue, right? That we don't. There's tremendous amounts of work being done just to understand like what the impact of that was. But it does look like it was. I mean, we know anecdotally also, we don't even have to look at numbers to know that it was a significant impact on everyone. Okay. Like it affected everybody in the world. And I can tell you for sure that the majority of the people that I work with, that experience, it just added to what they were struggling with. They were struggling already, but that's
Right. Because there's the isolation factor, the fear factor.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, that's
right.
That's probably a conversation in and of itself, and I want to respect your time. But so basically, I do think that the view of suicidality has changed over the years, where it used to be absolutely shunned and like a gigantic humiliation to the family, to the person. And I think that now there comes, especially now that we have more data about people who have attempted suicide and the attempt of the suicide, those people are able to reflect on what their thoughts were in those final moments before they thought they were going to die. And the teshuva that came about as that. Right? Have you heard about this? Where, I mean, there was one that was, very, very. When I heard this story of, there was a man who jumped off of the San Francisco bridge, yeah, and he survived. Yep. And he said the moment his fingers left the rail was the moment he regretted every single decision that brought him to that moment. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we have people who have attempted and are reporting about those final moments, I think that has impacted also the shift of looking at it as being a very selfish, like you don't think about the family, you're only thinking about yourself, you're obviously in despair and you can't think of any other solutions, and sort of like blaming and shaming to like your suffering and how can we help alleviate that lack of connection, that feeling like that's the only option. That's what I believe to be a mitigating factor in the shame and the blame and more of a gentler, approachable view towards suicidality.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you're describing, and to be really concrete about it, this individual that you're talking about jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. He became a real activist, right, in terms of educating people, right. So he really turned his experience into, it was certainly very powerful and created a lot of meaning for him. And he began educating people, right, to help them. Okay, so that's certainly, that's certainly true that it affected not just him but lots of other people because he speaks to people, right, and lets them know like what was happening. And I have had cases where somebody, I mean, gosh, if someone had not found them, they would be dead. And now looking back on it, they regret it. Right? They were very happy that they were saved. Right? Certainly in the moments, right, leading up to it, they thought that they'd made the right decision. Listen, it's an interesting area that I find within my own work. Like there are people like that. Not all of them are like that though. Like I've also had people who tried to kill themselves, and their regret was around not succeeding, as they call it.
Right.
So So it's an interesting space.
Yeah.
Where we're trying to get people is into a place of, well, as one of the rabbis said last night to me, he's like, oh wow, you're really creating bitachon with people. Like that's really where you're helping them, get to, right, in the work that you're doing. And I accept that. I think that's accurate. Certainly, like loyalty and faith in themselves, right, first and foremost. Sure, it'd be wonderful if I can also help someone get to a place where they really appreciate their life. They really have meaning and purpose and see their life as a life that's worth living.
Right. So what would be like a takeaway that you would want us as listeners to have as a result of this conversation? I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation, based on my limited knowledge, and your more extensive knowledge. I think it was a good conversation, but what would you want people to take away from this conversation?
I think it's two things. One is that it really is important to look at suicide risk as a state of severe suffering. So to be real concrete about it, if someone even says that they're thinking about that, or they make a very quick reference to how they'd like to die, look at it as an expression of suffering, right? Like that's how much they're suffering. And if someone is suffering, you don't call the police. You talk to the person and you connect with them and you work on understanding. That's the continuation, right, of having understood the suffering and having been sensitive to it. And then the second thing is, quite honestly, like, reach out to me if you've got questions. I'm happy to be in touch. I'm happy to see emails. You're upset about something I said, I'm happy to get those too. So,
Right. Which sounds like it's bound to happen in this space where there's so much unknown, and so many myths and misconceptions, that's bound to be part of the conversation where I really appreciated your time. This has been really meaningful. I'll put your contact information in the podcast notes. I will be releasing this as a special episode, not as our regular standard episodes, because I feel like I want to get this out to the public sooner rather than later. And Baruch Hashem, right now the podcasts are scheduled out until like February, so I don't want to wait that long. But I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Siegelman, and we will be in touch.
Excellent. All right.
Hey, have a good night. Bye-bye.